For days, that cat lay outside the store, always in the same place, as if he were waiting for something that never arrived. People went in and out, looked away, closed the door behind them. Some noticed, others pretended not to see. At night, when the store closed, the cold increased and the silence grew heavier. The cat didn't move much. He didn't meow. He simply remained there, weaker each day. No one imagined that this night would be different, that something would happen when the lights went out, that after so many days of being ignored, everything would change in a few hours. The store was on a street that was busy during the day, but strangely lonely at night. It was the kind of place everyone knows, but no one really notices. The cat appeared there without drawing attention. On the first day, he stayed near the window, trying to warm himself with the little heat that escaped from inside. On the second, he was already closer to the door. On the third, he became part of the landscape. People began to recognize his presence, but not in a way that generated care, just as something that had always been there. Some employees would comment quickly upon opening the store. Others complained in silence. Customers entered, glanced, and moved on. No one stopped long enough to understand why that cat remained there, even with the cold, hunger, and rain. He didn't seem aggressive. He didn't ask for anything. He just stayed, as if the store door were the last frontier between him and some kind of shelter that never opened for him. During the day, the movement helped distract him from the exhaustion. At night, everything became harder. The lights went out, the street emptied, and the wind took over the space. The cat huddled near the closed door, trying to protect himself as best he could. Each night seemed longer than the previous one. Each morning was a silent effort to keep staying there. As the days passed, his body began to show clear signs of exhaustion. The cat no longer changed positions much. His eyes remained half-closed. The world seemed distant. Still, he kept returning to the same spot, as if that door represented something greater than just a store. It represented the idea that someone at some point might finally see him. But on that specific night, something was different in the air. It wasn't just the cold. It was the feeling that time was running out, and that, if nothing happened, that silent waiting would end there. Before we continue this story, leave your like now if you like moving and real stories like this one. Subscribe to the channel. I have a dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers, and every subscription makes an enormous difference to me. And tell me in the comments, from which country are you watching this story? The cat didn't choose that store by chance. He arrived there after trying other places, other doors, other corners that seemed to promise shelter, but never followed through. In every attempt, the result was the same. A few hours of tolerance, then the dismissal, a wave of a hand, a kick in the air, a loud noise. The store, on the contrary, never expelled him directly. The door closed at night, but during the day it remained open. That was enough for him to stay. In the first few days, the cat still moved along the sidewalk. He would walk a few meters, sniff bags, observe people eating inside the establishment. Sometimes someone would drop something on the floor, and he would approach carefully. There was no conflict. Other animals didn't appear. It was a silent, predictable territory, and predictability for those living on the street is worth more than comfort. Over time, his body began to get used to that fixed point. The cat started lying always in the same spot, leaned against the wall, close to the door. There the wind was a bit weaker. There the human scent was constant. There he could observe without being observed too much. People began to recognize him as part of the scenery. The store cat, some would say, but recognizing is not the same as caring. The employees had different reactions. One of them avoided looking down. Another complained that it might drive customers away. There were also those who felt pity, but never enough to act. The store's routine continued, and the cat remained there as an uncomfortable reminder of something no one wanted to take responsibility for. At night, when the door closed, the cat moved even closer. He lay almost glued to The entrance, as if that could protect him from the cold, coming from the street. He didn't understand why the door never opened for him, but he understood that behind it there was warmth, there was light. There were people who didn't have to fight to survive until the next morning. The rain was a test. On days when it rained hard, the ground became freezing and slippery. The cat huddled as much as he could, trying to keep his body dry. Some people passed by running, complaining about the weather. Others opened larger umbrellas. No one stopped. The water ran down the sidewalk, and the cat remained there motionless, as if he had understood that moving would bring nothing better. As the days passed, hunger began to mix with exhaustion. The cat no longer reacted to every person passing by. He no longer raised his head every time the door opened. His body was heavier, his movements slower. Still, every morning, he was there, in the same place, as if leaving meant admitting there was nothing left to wait for. Some children would point, some adults looked away. A couple even commented that he was always there. That observation, said in a neutral tone, carried something cruel. The cat was there because he had nowhere else to go, because no one had chosen him, because staying still was less painful than trying again. On that specific day, the movement was lighter. The sky darkened earlier. The store closed a bit before the usual time. The cat felt the change. The silence arrived too fast. He tried to adjust, but his body no longer responded as before. His breathing was shorter. The cold seemed to pierce through everything. Even so, he didn't get up to leave. Not because he believed someone would come, but because that place was all that remained. The closed door represented a promise that never came true, but it also represented the last connection to a world where things still worked. When the night truly began, the cat was more motionless than ever. Anyone passing by at that moment might have thought he was sleeping, but it wasn't sleep. It was profound exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that arises when the body is running out of options, and it was exactly on that night, when everything indicated that nothing would change, that something different began to take shape. Not in an obvious way, not with noise, but with a detail too small to be ignored by anyone who was paying attention. The night fell in a different way that day. It wasn't sudden, but dense. The streetlights flickered on earlier, reflecting off the damp asphalt, and the movement faded far too quickly. The store closed its doors with a sharp, definitive click. The cat felt the sound, as he always did. Not as a direct rejection, but as an impossible boundary to cross. Still, he pressed closer to the door, leaning his body against the cold wall, trying to catch the last vestige of warmth coming from within. Silence began to take up space. During the day, the constant noise helped mask hunger and fatigue. At night, everything became sharper. The wind swept through the street corridor, entering through invisible cracks. The cat tried to huddle smaller, but there was no longer much to adjust. His body was rigid, heavy, as if every muscle had forgotten its purpose. A few people still passed by, not many, and almost always in a hurry. They walked, looking straight ahead, carrying bags, phones, distant thoughts. One woman slowed her pace for a second, looked at the cat, and placed her hand over her heart. She hesitated, then she moved on. The cat watched without expectation. He had already learned that human hesitation rarely turns into action. The street grew empty. The sound of cars became more distant. The cat closed his eyes for a few moments, not to sleep, but to save energy. His breathing was short and irregular. At certain moments it seemed to require too much effort. He opened his eyes again when he felt a stronger shiver run through his body. The cold now didn't just come from the ground, it came from within. At some point in the night the cat tried to stand up. His front paws responded, but the back ones failed for a second too long. He stumbled and had to lean against the wall again. The movement caught no one's attention. There was no one left to see. The world seemed to have completely forgotten that particular stretch of the street. A fine rain began, almost imperceptible. Tiny drops touched the ground and evaporated under the streetlights. Gradually the water accumulated, running toward the sidewalk where the cat lay. He tried to shift his position, but his body would not cooperate. Every attempt demanded an effort he no longer possessed. The water soaked his fur, making the cold even more intense. The cat stopped reacting to the stimuli around him, the distant sound of a motorcycle, the closing of a door far off. Everything seemed to happen on another plane. His consciousness began to flicker. He blinked slowly, struggling to keep his eyes open. There was no explicit fear. There was something quieter and more dangerous: surrender. It was in this state that footsteps emerged, different from the ones before. Not fast, not decided. Footsteps that slowed their pace as they approached the closed store. The cat did not react immediately. He had seen many feet pass by. He didn't raise his head. He didn't move. The footsteps stopped a few meters away. There was silence. A different kind of silence, heavy with attention. The cat blinked with difficulty and slowly raised his head a few centimeters. The figure before him stood still, looking directly down. There was no rush in that body, no phone in hand, just someone standing in a nearly empty street, before a cat that seemed to have nowhere else to go. The person moved a little closer and knelt down. The cat tried to retreat, but his body did not respond. A low sound escaped his throat, more a reflex than a plea. The stranger immediately perceived his condition. The proximity revealed the wet fur, the thin body, the opaque eyes. The man took a deep breath. He said nothing at first. He carefully took off his coat and placed it around the cat, shielding him from the soaked ground. The fabric wasn't new, but it was warm. The cat felt the difference almost immediately. His breathing was still difficult, but the cold stopped being a constant aggression. The man looked around, assessing the empty street, the closed store, the late hour. He knew there wasn't much time. He knew that if he left, no one else would pass by that night. He leaned in again, carefully supporting the cat's body with his hands and lifting him slowly. The cat did not resist, not out of trust, but out of a lack of strength. The world swayed slightly as he was lifted, but something in that proximity seemed to hold his consciousness to the present. The human warmth, the steady movement, the absence of false haste. As the man moved away from the store, carrying the cat against his chest, the door remained closed behind them. The street remained empty. The night followed its indifferent course. But for the cat, something fundamental had changed. After days of being just part of the scenery, someone had decided to interrupt their own path. And that decision, made when everything seemed too late, was what separated a silent wait for the end from a real possibility of moving forward. The journey away from the store took place in almost absolute silence. The street seemed larger now, emptier, as if it had been cleared on purpose for that very moment. The man walked carefully, adjusting the cat's body against his chest to protect him from the wind and the fine rain that insisted on falling. Every step was firm but measured. There was no uncontrolled panic, only conscious urgency, the kind of urgency that understands any wrong move could cost everything. The cat felt the gentle sway of each step, but the world around him seemed distant, as if observed, through a thick layer of glass. Sounds arrived muffled, the light from the street lamps transformed into blurred patches. Still, something kept him there, awake enough not to lose himself completely. The human warmth was constant. It didn't come and go like the heat from the store during the day. It remained. At one point, the man murmured something low, almost an apology that had no clear recipient. Perhaps it was for the cat, perhaps for himself, perhaps for time, which always arrives too early, or too late. The cat didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. There was no demand, there was no expectation, only presence. The path seemed too long for the state the cat was in. In some stretches, the man slowed his pace even more, feeling the fragile body adjust against his own. The cat breathed with difficulty, but he breathed. Every inhalation seemed to require conscious effort. The man felt this. He felt the irregular rhythm against his own chest, and knew he couldn't waste time. They arrived at a brightly lit place, small, almost hidden between larger buildings, a simple clinic, with the lights still on despite the hour. The man stopped before the door for a second, took a deep breath, and knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed in the empty street. Time stretched cruelly in that interval. Inside, footsteps approached. The door opened partially, and the man spoke quickly, without dramatizing. He didn't exaggerate the situation. He simply showed the cat. The wet, thin, motionless body. That said everything. The person on the other side opened the door completely and made an immediate gesture for them to enter. The environment changed again. The air was warmer, heavy with unfamiliar scents. The cat felt different hands touching his body, now with technical urgency. He was placed on a soft surface, far from the cold floor. The light was not aggressive, but sufficient. The man stepped back a few paces, watching, like someone who understands that certain decisions must be handed over to other hands. The cat reacted very little. His body was at the limit. Even so, small signs began to emerge, an involuntary twitch of a paw, an almost imperceptible movement of the tail. His breathing, though still weak, began to gain a slightly more stable rhythm. It wasn't an improvement, it was resistance. Someone commented on hypothermia, dehydration, infection, words the cat did not understand, but that the man recognized as signs of how close. Everything had come to the end. He sat in a nearby chair, hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed. He didn't ask excessive questions. He knew that at that moment the best thing he could do was not leave. Time passed strangely. Minutes felt far too long. At some moments the cat seemed to slide away, as if being pulled by something invisible. In others, he reacted to minimal stimuli, a hand touching, a voice calling softly. The body fought without fanfare, without a spectacle. In one of those moments, the cat opened his eyes and found the man's gaze. The vision was blurry, but recognition came quickly. It was the same face that had stopped on the street, the same scent, the same presence. The cat blinked slowly. It wasn't a plea. It was a silent acknowledgement. The man noticed and straightened his posture without realizing he was doing it. Something there was taking root. Hours later, the situation began to stabilize. There were no guarantees, but there was a possibility. The cat's body was responding to the warmth, to the slow hydration. He was still too weak to move on his own, but he was no longer sliding away. Someone commented that this night had been decisive, that if he had arrived just a little later, there might not have been enough time. The man heard this in silence. He didn't feel immediate relief. He felt weight, the weight of knowing that this story had depended on minutes, on steps, on a decision that might not have been made. He remained there, even when they said it would take time, even when the movement in the clinic slowed. The cat, exhausted, finally let his eyes close for longer periods. Not because he was giving up, but because, for the first time in days, his body didn't have to fight against the cold while also fighting against hunger. The rest was still fragile, but it was real. Meanwhile, outside, the street remained empty. The store stayed closed. No one there would know that, just a few hours earlier, a cat had been on the brink of disappearing. The world went on. But inside that small lit space, something had been interrupted. The cat wasn't saved. Not yet. But he had crossed the most dangerous line. And that only happened because someone decided to stop when no one else did. Recovery did not arrive as an immediate relief. It came as a fragile process, built upon tiny improvements that needed to be protected at all times. The cat's body was still at its limit. reacting slowly to every attempt at stabilization. The warmth helped, the hydration helped, but the exhaustion accumulated from so many days outside the store did not disappear overnight. The body was relearning how to remain. In the first moments of clearer consciousness, the cat found everything strange. The scent of the environment was different from anything he had ever known. There was no constant aroma of food passing nearby, nor the wind bringing unpredictable odors. It was a stable, almost neutral smell. This should have been comforting. But for someone accustomed to the street, the absence of variation also triggered alert. The cat remained watchful, even when his eyes closed. The man continued to be there. He didn't get too close, didn't touch without necessity. He simply remained, sitting in silence, following every small sign. He understood, even without any formal training, that this cat needed space to reorganize himself. It wasn't the time to demand answers or create expectations. It was the time to not go away. When they finally allowed the cat to be taken out of the clinic, the journey was made with the same care as the previous night. His body was still weak, but no longer completely absent. The cat felt the sway of the steps, recognized the rhythm, recognized the warmth. Still, he kept his eyes half open, as if ready to wake up completely at any sign of danger. The new environment was small, simple, and silent. There was no luxury or excess. There was order. The man prepared a specific space away from drafts, with something soft to support the body. The cat approached slowly, sniffing, analyzing. He didn't lie down immediately. Experience had taught him that new places require extreme caution. He circled a few times before settling in. During the first few days, he hardly moved. He slept for long periods, waking only to drink water and accept small amounts of food. His body still rejected excess. Each meal was a silent test. Sometimes he ate a little more, other times almost nothing. The man watched, adjusted, and respected. There was no rush. Haste had almost cost everything. Fear was still there. At times, the cat would wake up agitated, as if he were back outside the store, feeling the door close. The body reacted before the mind. Slight tremors, accelerated breathing. The man noticed these signs and simply stayed closer, without touching. This constant presence functioned as a silent anchor. It didn't erase the fear, but it prevented it from taking over everything. As the days passed, small changes began to emerge. The cat started to lift his head when the man entered the room. Later, he began to follow him with his gaze. One day, he took a few steps out of the space he had chosen as safe. He stopped halfway, evaluated, and went back. It wasn't a defeat. It was a test. Strength began to return slowly. His body was still thin, but it no longer seemed so rigid. His fur, previously dull, began to respond to care. The cat went back to cleaning himself, a simple gesture that carried deep meaning. It was the instinct of preservation, reclaiming its space. Even so, the fear of losing everything remained. A different sneeze, a day when the food didn't seem to go down well, a longer moment of apathy. Every small sign made the man remember the night in front of the store, the rain, the motionless body. He carried that memory as a constant alert, not as panic. He knew he couldn't completely relax just yet. On a quiet afternoon, something changed, almost imperceptibly. The cat walked over to the window and watched the street outside. People passed, cars went their way, stores opened and closed. The world went on. But now he observed it from a safe place. This difference, though subtle, was everything. The man noticed but didn't comment. He simply sat in another part of the room, respecting that moment. The cat stayed there for several minutes, then returned to his space. There was no rush. There was no demand. Time, finally, did not seem like an enemy. Now, night. The cat moved a little closer to the man while he was sitting. He didn't touch him. He just stayed close enough to share the warmth of the room. The man felt it, but didn't react. He allowed that gesture to exist without turning it into an event. They stayed like that for a few minutes, two beings marked by waiting, sharing the same silence. The recovery was still ongoing. There was no guarantee of a happy ending. But there was something new. Stability. The cat was no longer trapped in the cruel logic of the store's closed door. He no longer had to wait for something that never came. And even with the persistent fear that everything could still be lost, there was now a silent certainty. If something happened, it would not be ignored. It would not be left behind. Someone had stopped once, and that had already changed everything. The final decision did not happen in a dramatic way. There was no specific day when the man woke up and decided that the cat would stay forever. The decision was built in the details, in the small daily adjustments that ceased to be temporary. The cat's space stopped being improvised. It began to be planned. What was once "until he gets better" started to transform into "how to make this work." The cat noticed this change even before any explicit gesture. He noticed it when the routine stabilized, when the times began to repeat themselves, when food appeared without delay, when the environment stopped changing. For someone who spent days waiting outside a door that never opened, this predictability was something profoundly new. There was still fear. The cat carried invisible marks of the waiting. At certain moments, he was startled by sudden sounds. In others, he retreated for no apparent reason. The man did not interpret this as rejection. He understood it as memory. He knew that certain days hurt more than others, even when everything seemed safe. Over time, the cat's body responded better. His movements became firmer, his gaze more attentive. He began to move around the house with less caution, choosing places to lie down that were not just protective corners. One day, he settled near the man while he was sitting, without touching, but without maintaining an exaggerated distance. He stayed there for long minutes. That said everything. The man felt in that instant that there was no more choice to be made. The choice had already been made, without words. He had not saved a cat that night in front of the store, just to return him to the same world that almost lost him. He knew that, and accepting it was not a burden. It was a silent relief. On a clear morning, the man passed the store again where it all began. The door was open, people went in and out. The street followed its normal rhythm. No one there remembered the cat. No one knew how close that story had been to ending right there. He stopped for a few seconds, observed, and moved on. There was no bitterness, only awareness. At home, the cat slept, in a warm place, protected from the cold and the endless waiting. He didn't know what had almost happened. He didn't know that that night had been the limit, but he felt, in his body, the difference between being ignored and being seen in time. The final choice was not to take the cat in. It was to interrupt a cycle. It was not to repeat the indifference that transforms waiting into an end. It was to understand that sometimes all that separates a forgotten story from a transformed story is someone who decides not to keep walking. Before closing this story, I leave an important request. If you were moved by this journey, leave your like now. Subscribe to the channel. I have a dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers, and every subscription makes an enormous difference. And tell me in the comments, from which country are you watching this story? Not every story begins with an obvious rescue. Some begin with someone who remains where no one else stays. The cat in this story was not saved by chance. He was saved because someone decided to stop when the entire world kept moving forward, far too busy to notice what was being lost in silence. The store continued opening and closing. The street remained full during the day and empty at night. Nothing changed for those who passed by without looking down. But for the cat, everything changed the instant the waiting ended. Not because the door opened, but because someone on the outside decided to act. How many times do we mistake recognition for care? How many times do we notice something suffering and move on, believing it is not our responsibility? Stories like this don't just speak about abandoned animals. They speak about human decisions, too small to seem heroic, yet large enough to change destinies. May this story remain as a silent reminder. When we choose to stop, even if it is late, we can still make a difference. And sometimes that difference is everything someone needs to keep going.